You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
It's 2000 in Kyiv, 1900 in Paris, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Reflections on 72 of the weirder hours in recent history, a government at last in Austria, and have our dwindling attention spans done for the door-stopping literary novel. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Tessa Szyszkowitz and Lustig will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll speak to the poet Sarah Hesketh, who will also be reading from her new book, 2016. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Tessa Szyszkowitz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter and author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit, and Lustig, journalist and broadcaster, former presenter of The World Tonight on Radio 4. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew.
Hello, good evening.
Robin, I was assiduously researching your recent doings for the purposes. It's Monday, and I can't pronounce three-syllable words. This is going to be a long week. For the purposes of establishing light introductory banter at the top of the show, and discovered that you have done nothing, Robin.
I have done nothing visible. I haven't done very much invisible either, to be honest. There is so much going on out there in the big wide world that I find it quite exciting enough just watching. I don't have to do anything myself. I just watch what's going on.
This is exciting enough as in the sort of being excited, sitting behind the couch with fists balled up in eyes, etc.
Yeah, a bit like that. Exciting, terrifying, scary. But, you know, we're journalists and we do actually sort of live for this, don't we?
Well, kind of. Tessa, nudging us a bit closer to what we will shortly be discussing, you have recently been at least in the same room as Germany's outgoing Chancellor.
Yes, yesterday I was around in the centre of London. Very sunny, very nice, and also the faces were very sort of smiley of everyone, especially of the European leaders welcoming Zelensky after he had been humiliated in the White House. So that was quite nice. And so we also had all the briefings with diplomats. We were standing around between Downing Street or within the German embassy with Olaf Scholz, outgoing Prime Minister of Germany. And so it was quite an interesting day to think that this is the beginning of the sort of backlash against the ever increasing craziness of the US government's positions.
Well, we will start with, and listeners will need to imagine, a broad, dramatic sweep of one of the presenter's arms threatening any thin-stemmed glasses. Events. Roughly 72 hours ago, the president of a European country fighting for its survival against Russia got yelled at in the Oval Office by the president and vice president of the United States, which is arguably not how one might imagine Eisenhower and Nixon receiving Imre Nagy in 1956, or Johnson and Humphrey greeting Alexander Dubček in 1968. A great deal has occurred since, which we now propose to recapitulate and ideally make some sort of sense of. Robin, on Friday evening here time as it was, were you watching the live broadcast from the Oval Office?
I was. And the reason was that I actually had come to the view that the week that began on Monday of last week, so exactly 7 days ago, was going to be a week in which possibly the future of Europe was going to be decided. Because it started, of course, with President Macron of France in the White House. It then continued with Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK, also in the White House, and then, as you say, President Zelensky of Ukraine, also in the White House. And I think it was a week ago, it was the Macron visit, when we ought to have noticed that something was going wrong, because when he interrupted President Trump and corrected him on the amount of money that European nations had made available to Ukraine compared to the amount of money that the US had made available to Ukraine, and he said that Mr. Trump had got his numbers wrong. And the president looked at him and said words to the effect, well, you can believe that if you like, it's okay with me. And there was a hint of menace in that, which I don't think we picked up on at the time. And then, of course, it was made worse when Keir Starmer went and did exactly the same thing on Thursday and corrected him and interrupted him. And by the time poor Mr. Zelensky got there, Trump was ready to blow, and he did.
Well, this does prompt a question, Tessa, which a lot of people have been trying to figure out the answer to since Friday, which was this a deliberate setup of Zelensky by Trump and Vance, perhaps queued up by that clown asking him why he wasn't wearing a suit, or was it just one of those things that will happen when you have a bunch of people who don't really know what they're doing and you usher them all to a position where they are out of their depth?
Well, of course, I don't know that for sure. Like anyone else of us here doesn't know if they planned that or not. From the psychology of the situation, it was clear that usually you have a press photo op before talks and then you go, and not a 50-minute conversation where everyone is already exhausted from the sort of more and more spiraling out of control conversation and the topics that Trump brought up. So Zelensky endured this for about 48 minutes relatively calmly, more and more irritated by the craziness of also the content that was thrown at him. And so if it was a setup or not, but it was certainly a situation where none of these two presidents were there sort of out of their free will. So Macron had pushed Trump to invite Zelensky and had pushed Zelensky to go. Zelensky came from, as he said also yesterday with journalists here in London, that he was really exhausted coming off the 11-hour flight from Europe and being in a situation where he was sitting with a president, a vice president, in a hostile room of journalists, which are not like in previous time polite people from, CNN and the New York Times, but also this guy, Glenn, who was sort of probably put up to that question or had the sort of implicit permission to ask a question like this, which has no place in a serious conversation, of course. Let alone that Elon Musk walks the Oval Office in the same outfit.
Well, indeed so. But Robin, from that, we very swiftly then saw an outpouring of support from European leaders for Zelensky, most of them making an effort not to explicitly criticise the United States or its president. And then, of course, Zelensky comes here for the pre-planned summit. But I rather suspect that a few late additions were made in terms of the optics, because, of course, Starmer had gone to the White House and offered the state visit to President Trump. And quite quickly upon Zelensky's arrival here, he was whisked to wherever the king was for a fairly pointed photo op.
You know this line that President Trump came up with when he was talking to President Zelensky, "You've got no cards to play." Well, the UK has one card to play whenever it's in trouble, and that's the royal family. Wheel out the king. And that's what they did. And it's a good card to play because it made a point very forcibly to President Trump. You're not the only one who gets to see the king. President Zelensky gets to see the king, not in Buckingham Palace, not for a state visit, but he gets to see him in his private residence in Norfolk. So it was a very clever move by the Brits. I have to say, I think that the British Foreign Office and Keir Starmer have played whatever cards they do have extremely skillfully over the last week or so, because even though the conventional wisdom has been until now that the UK, since it left the European Union, is a much diminished power, suddenly you've got the British Prime Minister at the centre of events. You've got 14, 15 leaders all convening in London over the weekend. So that's all to the good. However, the fact remains that President Zelensky finds himself not only at war with Russia after Russia invaded a sovereign nation, but effectively at war with the United States as well. And that is a very, very bad place for him to be.
We will come back shortly to Sir Keir Starmer's position in all of this. But just finally on this, Tessa, as well as the dramatics and the optics and the theatrics around the summit, there was an actual summit. Do you glean from the substance of that summit that European leaders now, after however many wake-up calls they have had over the last 8 or 9 years, do actually get it and are prepared to actually do what needs doing?
Well, it might be too late because the dismantling of the Western order is going so quickly now that it's really very difficult to catch up. But yesterday I felt that there was a new sort of focus on really getting things done now. So a peace plan for the Ukraine is, of course, a little early if you think that Russia has not shown any intention to stop firing or bombarding or sending drones every night into that country and sort of threatening the civilians as well as the army there. So there's no sign of peace willingness from that side. And that's what Scholz also said yesterday. You know, the first thing that needs to happen for this is that Russia stops shooting. But in terms of the plan that the Europeans have, is the good thing is that you have a few of the bigger European member states that have armies that actually mean something, like France and also Germany, even if it's more reluctant to put boots on the ground. But that can happen. And then you have a very clear commitment to, and that was also clear yesterday, to continue to support Ukraine even if the US leaves. So it's not that they are saying now, okay, then we just take our hands off the whole thing and we'll let Kiev collapse into the Russian sphere. And so I think this is not to be underestimated because, of course, also something that Jeremy Hunt said on the weekend, former foreign minister of the UK, that it's one thing to talk like Trump, but the other one is to behave as the USA in Europe. You cannot just walk away. Also, you can say that, but in the end, there will be lots of negotiations, of course, if the US is, for example, pulling out 10,000 of troops from Europe, from Germany, from Poland, or if there's a negotiation going on about that. So a few of the adults left in the rooms will also sort of talk about these things in a little bit more detail than the President of the United States does at the moment.
Well, one of the key protagonists in the last 72 hours of high diplomatic drama is UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, whose last 5 days have been quite the wild ride. Last Thursday, which now feels like it happened circa the wreck of the Hindenburg, Starmer visited the White House and won generally good reviews for distracting President Trump with a bright, shiny thing, specifically a state visit, sufficiently to apparently keep him on side. This was swiftly followed by Friday's grotesque berating of President Zelensky, at which Starmer found even the Daily Mail demanding Trump's invitation be revoked. He is now striving to keep the Atlantic shores from drifting further apart. Here he is speaking to Parliament earlier today.
And we will never choose between either side of the Atlantic. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if anything, the past week has shown that idea is totally unserious.
Robin, it's clear enough that what he is trying to do, and he's not the first occupant of his role to have attempted to thus position himself, he wants the UK to be the bridge between Europe and the United States. That's not always been an easy role to fulfil. It's possibly more difficult now than usually. Is it doable from where we are?
I fear that the answer to that is increasingly no. Because even though Keir Starmer and indeed other European leaders keep insisting that they don't believe that the transatlantic alliance has been broken, the evidence before our eyes is that it is in the process of being broken by President Trump as a deliberate act of US policy. It looks to me as if what President Trump wants to do is in effect form an alliance with Russia, with President Putin, and that he's not interested in his traditional alliances, the American traditional alliances, with Western Europe, what used to be called Western Europe. And that's very, very serious. And that's why I started by saying that I think the past week may very well, when historians look back at it, turn out to have been the week when Europe's destiny was decided.
Is there any argument, do we think, Tessa, that this is a role that, if it can still be fulfilled, is actually it's more easily fulfilled by the United Kingdom outside the European Union, that it can present itself as a sort of impartial broker between the United States and Europe? Because, in fairness, President Trump and certainly Vice President J.D. Vance's animus does seem to be more specifically directed against continental Europe than it does the United Kingdom.
I actually don't think that. I think the UK could play within the European Union the same role as a bridge, if you so want, or keeping up the special relationship, because that has existed always. And Trump, don't forget, has golf courses in Scotland, which makes him always look at the UK a bit more favourable than on other countries. But seriously, I think that it's a very important role that Starmer can play now, the UK can play. And it's very good for Europe, because it also means that the UK is reorienting itself more to the European continent, the more the US is sort of leaving Western reasoning behind. So that's good for Europe. That's good for putting heads together, for planning also the security together. And King Charles is one of the big trumps that the UK has, the assets that they can bring up. But the other one is, of course, the army. So there's a military might that the UK can bring in that Europe desperately needs. And so everyone has an open mind now of having these summits brought together by European leaders outside of the EU structures and institutions. And Starmer can come there, and you can invite Turkey and Canada easily to it to make it look a little bit more palpable for all those European member states that are not invited to it. But it's also a really great sign that, for example, you had yesterday in London all these people who wanted to help the Ukraine, and Viktor Orban of Hungary was just not invited. Like in the Paris format, also the London format was like this. So you leave those guys who are already in the camp of Putin behind in these conversations where you really make a constructive progress on thinking how to establish a common European security zone. And because it's not an EU policy to have a defence policy together, it's a very good idea to bring in the UK. So it's a actually fabulous concept. And if I just may add this is the beginning also of a political pushback, I think, because you had in the European elections now a lot of this sort of far-right parties gaining power. And now people see what happens if they actually make it to power. And they're becoming a little bit more they question more what it actually means to give your vote to AfD or to FPÖ in Austria. And here in the UK to Nigel Farage or these Trump fans. So Starmer has a very good position to strengthen, even outside of the European Union, the political centre in Europe.
I think one advantage he has by not being in the EU is that he can move more quickly. In the EU, things take time because you need to consult, you need to get consensus, you need the Commission involved. The UK outside the EU, and I think we've seen it over the last 72 hours, can actually move very quickly. And as Tessa says, you don't have to invite every member of the EU, can pick and choose. This lovely phrase, the coalition of the willing. And that is an advantage that the UK has outside the EU, perhaps unanticipated.
Just finally on this, Robin, you mentioned that phrase which I was about to mention. And in terms of the way that Starmer has handled the last it can't only be 5 days. It's not even 5 days. It's 4 days. He's a man who chooses his words very carefully. He would not have used the phrase coalition of the willing on a whim. That is a phrase first coined, of course, by President George W. Bush on the eve of the Iraq War in 2003. Is that Starmer just maybe subtly trying to give America a bit of a dig in the ribs, just saying, can we just remember who turned up when you needed people to turn up?
Oh, very much so. I think it's very deliberate. He has people around him in Downing Street who are veterans of the Tony Blair administration, and they do have memories, and they remember that era very clearly. And so, yes, I think this is very much a way of saying to the US, not necessarily to Mr. Trump, who I don't think will be interested in such references back to history, but to the US more generally, just remember when we came to your aid, when you were under attack. Remember when NATO came to your aid. There was a coalition of the willing then. Let's have one now.
Well, let's take a look now at Austria, which does now have a government a mere 5 months after its most recent general election. Not for the first time in recent European history, a coalition of runners-up has gathered to keep off the government benches the Populist Party, which won the most votes. In this instance, the far-right Vladimir Putin enthusiasts of the Freedom Party, who were unable to persuade the more mainstream conservatives of the People's Party to serve as a junior partner. Instead, the People's Party People's Party, will govern in cahoots with the centre-left Social Democrats and the centrist Liberals of NEOS. People's Party leader Christian Stocker will be Austria's new Chancellor. Tessa, this is their second attempt to put this coalition together. Why has it worked this time when it didn't the first?
First of all, I like it when you say these German names. You know, Herr Stocker. Herr Stocker is our new Chancellor now. It has worked now because some of the Conservatives, during these short-lived coalition talks with the far-right Kickl party, Herbert Kickl is the name of the party, they got scared of his positions. They realized that you cannot actually bring this man as a prime minister to a European Council, because Kickl has always said he's against sanctions against Russia, for example. Yeah, he was not only playing with the thought of leaving the European Union behind, which is completely unthinkable for the Austrian economy. So some more reasonable people in the Conservative Party then said, like, no, it's just not feasible. And also they had a big clash over the Home Office, where the security services, or whatever that's called in Austria, are located. And Kickl said that he needed this ministry under his control. And he had that already up to 2019, when he was the first time in coalition, and he was the Home Office secretary. And that was the time when everything that happened in Austria also went to Moscow in a straight line of FSB contacts that were planted by Kickl's men, and not necessarily by him, but by sort of a network of underlings that were taking care of the good contacts with Russia's secret services. And so there was an alarm signal in conservative circles, and then in the end they broke off the coalition, which the coalition talks, and that brought back everyone else. And I think this is a period where everyone realizes how dangerous it is to really play as if democracy is something that you can turn on and off, because people in Austria now realize in 5 months of these coalition talks that the democratic parties, left and right of center, you can have differences about if you want kindergarten places for 2-year-olds, or if neutrality, like Austria's military neutrality, is if that's necessary or not. Now you have people who say, like, okay, we make a compromise on our 100% party manifestos, and what we get. But the main thing is we do have a democratic government. So in that sense, today is a good day in Austria.
Robin, the Freedom Party would doubtless beg to take issue with that characterisation of what Austria now has as a democratic government. And is there a concern that when manoeuvres like this are pulled, and we have seen this happen to various what you might call populist parties in the Netherlands, the Republic of Ireland and elsewhere, they do very well, they might even top the poll, but they get frozen out of government. And given that so many of populist parties trade on a narrative of paranoia, self-pity, the elite stitching everything up to keep the voice of the common person suppressed, does this not risk feeding that narrative?
Well, I was doing some arithmetic earlier, and if you add together the votes that went to the parties that now have agreed to form the government, so the 3 parties, between them got more than 50% of the vote. So you could argue, in fact, that they more closely represent the views of Austrian voters than the Freedom Party of it on its own, which only got less than 30% of the vote. There is one other point where I think it's important to say that what's happened today in Austria is very good news for Europe generally, because it's shown that you can put together a government which doesn't contain the seeds of its own destruction. One of the great weaknesses of democracies is that they can sometimes build in their own weakening or even destruction. You look at what's happened in Hungary, you look at what's happened in Turkey, you could even look at what's happened in India, which used to pride itself on being the world's largest democracy. Well, it's barely democratic now. In all those 3 cases, as a result of votes that were cast, governments that came to power, but where there wasn't this so-called firewall, there wasn't this agreement that certain parties which were, in essence, anti-democratic, should be allowed to form a government in a democracy and then dismantle the democracy.
Tessa, finally and briefly, if possible, on this one, I think a question that will occur to the passing listener is, honestly, how are the People's Party still a thing, not the Freedom Party, rather, still a thing at all? Because they have been in government before and pulled the whole thing down in somewhat undignified circumstances. This was the Ibiza-gate scandal, which I do commend people look up because it is frankly hilarious, which, among other consequences, did prompt a brief revival for the musical stylings of the Venga Boys.
Briefly, collective amnesia. People forget, and they are still angry. They are angry because things don't work so well for them in the economy. A lot of companies have to go out of business if they don't find plans now to restructure. So it's a tough time, and people are angry, and they look for an opposition party that they can vote for. Unfortunately, they don't vote for the Green Party to save the planet, but they go to the far right to kick foreigners out. I don't know if it's a productive program, but in this case, in Austria, 29% of the people did so in September.
Well, to that part of the show now where we find out if a table full of journalists and or authors of a certain age would like to bemoan the dwindling attention spans of modern generations and or the idleness and ineptitude of publishers, among other reasons why we are not all whimsically tapping out 100 words a day of our next bestsellers in our immense gated mansions in Hampstead, because it cannot possibly be anything to do with our books. The shortlist of this year's International Booker Prize is out, and short is the operative word. Only one clears 300 pages and most are under 200. In perhaps related tidings, one major publisher, Simon & Schuster, has resolved to dispense with blurbs, i.e. those exclamations on book jackets on which authors who very often play tennis together confirm that each other's works are timely and relevant. Robin, do you have, first of all, any thoughts about the appalling apparent brevity of the modern novel? I mean, I am speaking as somebody who's read quite a few 200-page novels and thought they were too long.
I like long novels. I like novels I can get my teeth into. I like novels that I can lose myself in. I am currently about 3/4 of the way through a novel by a Victorian English novelist called Anthony Trollope, which is about 750, 800 pages long.
But 750 pages is that's throat clearing for Trollope.
Well, but
he's just warming up.
My wife has just finished reading what was the Booker Prize winner last year, which was 140 pages long, and she was very disappointed.
100, that's a record review. That's not a... That's
so I'm in favour of long novels because they're not journalism, and I like a break from journalism. And if I'm going to read a book, I want it to be something that I can get lost in.
Tessa, are you a big fan of the 1,000-page tome in tiny writing?
I think the beauty of books is that they don't have to have a bite-sized chapter length. And that's the difference to TV or also theatre, where I really think discipline is a good thing, because after 2 hours, you
that's so with
have
films
an
now,
intermission.
Though, because films are all 3 hours
Yeah, the
long.
Brutalist and all this. But it works in the Brutalist if you have a break and you can come back. But in general, books should have the length, whatever authors want to do. I'm totally for that. And I read them also sometimes, because you don't have to finish in one evening. You can sort of pick it up the next evening. Having said that, my most favorite novel of the last 2-3 years was Claire Keegan's Small Things Like This, and it's exactly, I think, 119 pages, where she describes in every word and so precise the most beautiful and deep sort of fiction novel that you don't need another 600 pages for it. And so I think there's a real beauty.
I agree with you on that one, yeah.
I mean, I have a certain amount of sympathy, speaking as I think I had to cut 80,000 words out of the first draft of my last book. I was enjoying myself, as I said to the publishers, and why wouldn't the readers? But we should move on to the subject of blurbs, Robin. And I have to say, somewhat sceptical about their efficacy, because I have been fortunate and indeed honoured to have been blurbed once or twice by some fairly distinguished figures, and I have to say that whatever influence they may have was not reflected in the sales figures, which is a roundabout way of saying no bugger bought any of them anyway.
It's a strange business, isn't it? I mean, in the last 6 months, I've been asked by 3 friends to provide blurbs for their books. And I have found it a difficult experience. First of all, because I would not necessarily have read them.
They're that good, are they?
Don't tell us the name.
No, of course you want to say something nice about a friend's book, but you have to say it in a few words. I don't think blurbs do any good, frankly. I'm always amused by, as you say, the tit-for-tat, in which one author A says nice things about author B, and then author B says nice things about author A. What do we learn? Not a lot.
I mean, would there be something, Tessa, if they had the virtue of honesty, if the blurb actually said, I haven't read this, but he said something nice about my last book, which on reflection I'm pretty sure he never read either, so here we all are.
No, doesn't make any sense to do that, because that's what we already sort of assume. But I have to say, I don't know why there's a sort of campaign against blurbs now on books. I mean, I like to meet new friends through the recommendation of old friends too. I mean, sometimes it's maybe a setup, but on the other hand, if you know that there are some serious authors who have read this book and consider this to be readable, I think it's just a little help on the side. If it's for friends, okay, fine, but it's still a good idea to have them. Why not?
I don't think I believe blurbs. I think that's my problem.
Have you never been enticed by one, Robin? Is there anybody, if not, whose name endorsing a book might actually draw you to take a closer look?
I am influenced by what my friends tell me they have read and enjoyed, much more than by what blurb I might see on the cover of a book. Personal recommendation matters much more to me than a recommendation from somebody whose work I may know and admire, but whom I don't know. I'll go on personal recommendation every time.
But to return finally, Robin, to the ethical difficulties imposed by being asked, what are you going to do? How are you going to furnish blurbs for these books?
Yes.
Will they all be the same one?
No.
I heartily endorse this product or service. Robin Lustig.
I endorse this message. No, I take friendship seriously. I read the books that my friends send me, and I say something nice about them within the bounds of honesty.
Can Andrew and I contact you next time?
Tessa Szyszkowitz and Robin Lustig, both of whom do have books which are readily available, as indeed does the presenter of this broadcast. Thank you for joining us. And finally, on today's show, it is arguable that the oddness of the last few days, as we have been discussing, is merely an extension and or expression of a greater oddness which began metastasizing in 2016, which, by splendid coincidence, is the title of the book by our next guest. 2016, by the poet Sarah Hesketh, recalls and reveals the year of Trump 1, Brexit, the death of David Bowie, and Leicester City's Premier League title through the first-person recollections of people who lived through it. I spoke to Sarah earlier, and I began by asking the admittedly honkingly obvious question of why she had picked on 2016.
Well, it was an accident of timing, and also, I suppose, it was... When I first took this book to the potential publisher for it, he said, 2016, yes, 1939, which did kind of resonate. So I was lucky enough to get a PhD scholarship, which started in January 2017, about a week after Trump's inauguration. And I had to come up with a potential topic for this creative writing PhD. And the world seemed inescapable at that point. And there is a great quote by an American poet, sadly now deceased, called C.D. Wright, who, when talking about wanting to write about the industrial prison complex in America, said, I wanted to see if my art could handle that hoe. And I think the same challenge applied to me, in that I looked at the world potentially burning around us and thought, what can I do with this? Can poetry do anything with it at all? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, you're going to do a couple of readings from the book, which I think probably give a better idea of what the book is than any amount of questions I can possibly ask you about it. But in introducing the two excerpts, by way of also illuminating your process, can you tell us a bit about whose voice we're hearing and how you found them?
Yeah, so one of the voices is a pro-Trump voter, which for a nice middle-class Islington living girl like me was something that I thought was going to be quite difficult to find. And generally the process of recruitment for all of the speakers in the book, I would start and think, do I know anybody personally? And in the end, I think there are 3 people in the book that I would sort of class as friends or acquaintances. And then for everybody else, I just asked around. So for this particular Trump voter, I just put a call out on Facebook and said, does anybody know anybody who A, voted for Trump, and B, might be willing to talk about it for an experimental poetry project? As you can imagine, the Venn diagram on that was pretty small.
That's a thin sliver.
Yeah, exactly. But I was lucky enough. I got a friend who is from the States, lives in London now, but she said, actually, I think I know somebody, a friend from back home who might be willing to talk to you, who is kind of keen to share their views and their motivations. And I got in touch and explained the project, and he was really happy to talk. And I think that's the thing that I found with a lot of the interviewees is that they felt, especially people who are maybe at odds, so the pro-Trump voter, the pro-Brexit voter, they felt like they hadn't been listened to before. And so the idea that someone did want to listen to them lay out all of their reasons for making a particular decision was actually quite an attractive thing for them. So again, the pro-Brexit voter that I'm going to read from here was also just a friend of a friend who I was able to connect with and actually go and interview in person also in Leicester. Leicester played a much bigger role in this book than I thought it was going to.
Let's hear it.
I did. My fixed idea was vote leave. When he announced the referendum, my immediate reaction was, yeah, of course, vote fucking leave, of course, because I like to bloody the nose. I'm a bit of a reactionary. I do like a bit of protest, I'm burn the Reichstag. I am a little bit like that. And I don't think these things through properly. And that reflects in my chess. And yeah, let's vote leave. And the more and more I considered it up to referendum day, I thought, you know what? My heart does say leave, but I can actually think of more reasons to vote to stay, to remain. So on the day I was like, I'm not sure. I haven't decided. The thing that swayed me is the arrogant buggers on Facebook, the Remainers, the Islington elite, that were sort of looking down their nose at people. All right, I'll just do the Trump one. I don't know. I had to vote for someone so Trump got the job. Trust me when I say the Republicans do things that drive me crazy also. Yes, ma'am. I think we are way too, as a party, we are way too beholden to big oil. I think it's insane. They can belch smoke into our air. Politics is just a nasty business, and what I am consistently forced to do is to, if one has any kind of moral compass, is to say which one of these horrible options is the least one.
That was Sarah Hesketh speaking to me earlier and reading from her new book 2016, which is available now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Tessa Szyszkowitz and Robin Lustig. Today's show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.